Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the fall version of the Forum. The Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers is one of the Episcopal Church's leading thinkers around 21st century ministry and mission. She is a priest, author, and speaker, and she currently serves as the Canon to the Presiding Bishop for Evangelism, Reconciliation, and Creation Care. She has worked for many years at the intersection of practice and reflection, renewal, and justice. Her latest book, The Church Cracked Open, Disruption, Decline, and New Hope for Beloved Community, is an important response to the question, what will the Episcopal Church look like over the next 50 years? Presiding Bishop Michael Curry has said, it will make a profound difference for the church in this moment in history. Today, we're going to talk about how we got here, what's next, and what difference that can make to the world. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
What a pleasure it is to be together today. I know. I've been looking forward to this so much. I was just thinking about just being back in Boston. You and I both had that experience for a season in our life.
Yes.
And I know there's many connections that we'll discover today, too.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. So how did you first become connected to the Episcopal Church?
It's kind of a labyrinth, labyrinth, right? A labyrinthine story in a way for me, because I grew up surrounded by church, surrounded by Christians, but very skeptical of Christianity. And so I drifted on the edge of church, down south when I was growing up. In college, I was a religion major, but didn't really want to be religious myself, just wanted to kind of study it. I was a religion reporter for a newspaper. You see a pattern. Now, like always watching other people's religious lives. And when I finally got baptized at age 28. So I've been not Christian more of my life than I've been Christian still.
That's great. People like that are so helpful to the church.
I hope so. I hope so.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, when I finally, was like, all right, Jesus kind of grabbed me and was like, all right, we're going to do this. I'm like, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. And I started out with a Lutheran church.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't want to get too theological about things, but I loved the Lutherans for so many reasons, still do. But I remember preaching sermons with the Lutherans, just like as a lay person. And people would come up and say, nice sermon, needs more cross. So, by which they meant that I was too obsessed about resurrection. Yeah. And they wanted to talk more about the cross. I'm like, well, but you know that the resurrection is after the cross. Like something comes after. So I was hanging with Episcopalians and like, oh, they understand that there's resurrection after the cross.
Yeah.
And I just felt like for myself, the world we live in, I need to be in a resurrection church, a church that can get down in the dirt with you and understand the pain, but that preaches a word of hope.
Yeah.
So I'm with the Episcopalians because this is where the hope
was,
and where the welcome was, and just all the things I dreamt about when I was hanging on the edge of church. I didn't know that there was an Episcopal church where all of these things were possible.
Yeah. I was in a Lutheran church for 2 years.
Yes.
And so I did like confirmation training there.
Yeah.
They were really good at that.
That's so funny.
That's one of their strengths.
Oh, dude.
And I definitely feel like we had 1 year of New Testament, 1 year of Old Testament, and it was a rigorous process. So I'm very grateful to the Lutherans for helping me in that way. But same thing, I just felt like that focus on substitutionary atonement, the cross. I totally believe in the suffering of Jesus and how transformative it is. But it is, you can stop there and not see beyond it.
Right. Well, and it just felt like I also came into Christianity through the doorway of liberation theology.
Yeah.
And so, I was reading, didn't even realize it at the time, but I was reading Episcopal theologians like Carter Hayward, folks like that. And what I knew was that in order to do liberation theology, what you're really talking about is you need a faith, you need a Jesus who goes to the cross and rises.
Yeah.
Who goes to the cross, dies with us, and then rises with us.
Yeah.
That's the liberation method and the liberation message. And And so I was like, I gotta have that. I gotta have that Jesus in my life. I got to even just be the Christian that I was, eventually by age 28 called to be.
Yeah, yeah, completely. Yeah, it's funny. So Carter was one of your teachers. So, how was that? I mean, she's such an extraordinary figure. I don't know about you, but I took them for granted. Sue High, Carter, all of them. I just figured everybody
These are all folks who taught us or taught at Episcopal Divinity School and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so, like, if you went to Harvard, which I did, you went there too. Yeah, that's what I thought. We were both at Harvard Divinity School, too. And so, like, you had access to Episcopal Divinity School and these legends of Episcopal liberation movements.
Exactly.
Some of the first women ordained in the Episcopal Church. And they were just our teachers.
They were.
You're like, what? Yeah, they made it hard, I will say. Like, they made it hard, I think, because you're like, all right, this is what church is supposed to be. Yeah, movement. Yeah. And then you graduate. You're like, I
really, where did
I got to
all
make
that
this.
go?
I got to make this work in church. And then you do. You try.
Yeah. So, when you were a child, like, what kind of things were you into? Like, what were you like as a kid? We all know what you're like now.
Yeah. I wonder, is this the book? I can't remember.
There's so much in there that I've underlined. It'll be easy to find whatever you're looking for.
I think, is this the one?
You talk about being an Episcopal Church nerd when you're little.
Yeah. Well, like a nerd, for sure. Yeah, I think maybe it's not. Maybe it's in the acknowledgments. I think in the acknowledgments of Church Cracked Open, I thank my mom. In fact, I think it is in this one. I'm sorry.
No, it is.
I think it's funny you're asking this, so I just feel like I really need to, like, literally acknowledge my mom. But there it is. Yes.
Underline that page too.
Yeah. Yes. To my mom, Mama Phyllis Spellers, who surrounded me with books and let her weird child be weird. That's how it's.
So what books were they? I guess that was the whole reason I asked the question.
Yeah, exactly. Like, well, I was surrounded by books as this little kid, the child of a single mom in Kentucky. My mom was a bookworm.
Yeah, that's great.
And she never went past, well, like, she did some college years, but she never finished college. But she just loved books, loved writing, had the most beautiful handwriting. And so, like, I remember, like, as a kid, I had a little typewriter, and I loved typing. Yeah, like,
that's great.
Like, I taught myself how to type whatever that every fox does. So I don't know, whatever it is, does quick something. So yeah, I was always writing. I wrote my first book in the 3rd grade.
Yeah, neat.
I was in the 3rd grade when I wrote my first book, and it was called The Girl's Guide to Meeting a Guy.
Wow, that's
and
good.
I can picture it so clear. It was like I created, like, there was a yellow piece of, like, construction paper was the cover, and there was this picture, like, stick figure picture of, like, a guy and a girl. I would now do sequels. Of course, The Guy's Guide to Meeting a Guy, A Girl's Guide to Meeting a Girl. But yeah, like, I just loved writing, and I loved sorting things out with people in writing. Yeah. And actually, I did write a sequel, I think, like, because the librarians at my school, my little elementary school in Frankfort, Kentucky, they put the book up, my little, like,
I love that.
in the library.
That's so great.
And other kids could, like, go and, like, check out Stephanie's book,
Yeah, so you had a readership at the 3rd grade.
I did in the 3rd grade. It was crazy. So I was really, like I said, I was a weird kid in a small town in Kentucky with a, wonderful, like, working class Black family. And I'm this kid who was, like, buying Earl Grey tea and cans of wonton soup. Like, I used my allowance to buy my own little cans of Campbell's wonton soup. That was that kid.
That's great.
And I would drink Earl Grey tea and eat wonton soup, like, at 10 years old.
What was high school like for you then? I mean, now that was just leading into high school.
Yeah, exactly. High school.
Kind of the same, still buying the wonton soup.
Yeah, I was buying the wonton soup. I was dreaming about other parts of the world and seeing things. I was singing in show choir.
Oh, that's great.
But also was, like, working on the yearbook staff, so still the writing, always the writing. I wrote a speech for Ronald Reagan in high school.
Wow. That's amazing. So
that's I'm just gonna let that land. So no, it was
we all have this like picture in our head of
like a 17-year-old. No, my high school, Knoxville, Tennessee. I went to high school in Knoxville, Tennessee. We were hosting the Southern Association of Student Councils. So all of these kind of like policy wonk kids from across the South who were serving as like the presidents and VPs and whatever of their school student government. And so they came together for this conference. And my high school, among other things, it was a public school, but like there were a lot of movers and shakers in the Republican Party in Tennessee who sent their kids to that school. And my mom and her brilliance found like affordable housing in the neighborhood so that I could go to that school. But anyway, so I was communications director for this student government conference. And they were like, we're going to have Ronald Reagan deliver a speech to these hundreds and hundreds of young people. It was kind of like the farm system for the Republican Party in a way.
Right, totally.
And so they're like, all right, we need someone to write up talking points for the president, for his team at the White House, so that he can do a speech to inspire young people, to patriotism and service. And I was like, well, I could write talking points, but I'll just write a speech. And then they can do with it whatever, they can pull the points they want, but I was in a mode. And the White House team got the speech and apparently were like, this is good.
Doesn't need too much changing.
Yeah, they really didn't change it much. So like I was applying for college, and on all of my essays, I managed to sneak in there, like speechwriter for Ronald Reagan.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So I would wear there was an entire year of high school when I only wore dinosaurs.
Oh, wow.
And then another year when I loved men's clothing.
Yeah.
And so I would wear these Oxfords with the wingtips and suspenders and blazers with patches.
Oh, I love it. So cute.
And ties. I truly I didn't know what cross-dressing or anything meant. But my mom, again, small town in Kentucky and then in East Tennessee.
Yeah, she's like,
who is this kid? And she's like, go.
Yeah.
Go. You be you. Go. I love that woman. I love that woman.
It's great. Oh my gosh! So then, when you went to college, how did your writing find expression there?
So I worked on the newspaper staff in college. I started out an English major, so always with the word. But then I realized that the words that really captured me most were the ones about things of ultimacy. That was a phrase I came up with in college. Right. I was that kid, 3 a.m. sitting up, in the lounge, in school, and everybody would be taking turns having conversations with me about things of ultimacy. It was like the Oprah show or something. So I ended up going into philosophy because actually the stuff that I really love in the words, it's when the words really matter about and say something about life. Right. And what means most.
That's why you're studying religion.
Yeah, and then I ended up studying religion. And then I ended up coming here.
Yeah, to San Francisco.
Yeah. I think it was the summer after I graduated from college and was studying and interviewing Buddhist nuns in San Francisco. To see how they were engaged in liberation theology. And so I have dreams. I've told friends of mine while I've been here, I still, that was 30 years ago. I still have dreams of San Francisco. In my dreams, it shows up. And because that was such a formative moment.
We're having interfaith services and we're here. They're here all the time.
Yeah, I remember coming to Grace actually during that time 30 years ago. And this truly, this was one of my first Episcopal experiences, was coming here in that moment when I was 21, I guess, had just turned 21, and was just exploring things of ultimacy.
Things of ultimacy.
But I knew that this was a church that explored that freely. So thank you for being a part of that journey.
Yeah, I love that part about Grace Cathedral. That there's a way in which we serve Episcopalians, but we really exist here for everyone.
Yes.
And I really love that part.
You were there for me. You were there for a lot of seekers.
Yeah.
You are there for a lot of seekers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now Harvard, what was it like when you first got there? So I brought this little book right here. So this book was published.
Oh my God, I remember this.
It was
The
published
Search for God at Harvard.
Yeah, by Ari Goldman. And it was published like a year, a year before I got there. Or all the people in there I know, like even the students I knew. So it was like
91. Yeah.
Yeah. So
what years were you there?
I was there 91 to 94.
That's right, and I was 93 to 96.
Yeah, so
we had some overlap. That's right. Yeah.
But I don't know what your first impressions were, but I would love to hear about them.
Oh golly, I mean, what you have to, and you don't have to, but what's helpful to remember, at least for my context, is that I was the first in my family to go to college, and to finish college, I should say. And so I went to Wake Forest University, which is a school in North Carolina, and I had all of these amazing professors who were like, you're going to go where we went. You're done with the South. You're going to Harvard. Yeah. I'm like, if you say so, but I don't know what that means. I mean, I knew, but I couldn't picture the kid from the working class, family, first in her family to even go to college, and now you're telling me I'm going to Harvard? Yeah. Okay. And I ended up, I went there, I left Boston for a year after I finished, and then I came back. So I was in Boston for 20 years.
Yeah.
But I never lost my sense of wonder about Harvard. I still I would walk around the quad, walk around, just like walk around Harvard Yard, walk around these storied streets and sit in these classrooms, one of my, I think I lived next door to Ralph Waldo Emerson's.
Yeah, right, in Divinity Hall.
Yeah, room, his actual dorm room.
Down the hallway. I lived in Octavius Brooks Frothingham's room.
Exactly, yes.
Horatio Alger was living
right,
there.
I know, it's crazy. And I could see there were other people who maybe had come up with that as an expectation of their lives.
Yeah.
But because I didn't, I felt like it was not a fairy tale, but just I was grateful.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what it is. I went through 20 years in Boston, and certainly those years at Harvard, steeped in gratitude, just amazed. It's where I found Harvard, where I found God.
Right.
Rather, was while I was at Harvard. Yeah, it happened. Search for God at Harvard. I actually found God at Harvard.
If I could take, there's a few moments in my life that I would love to repeat, but one of them is when the students first arrive and you go to Harvard, Divinity Hall Chapel.
Yes.
And Peter Gomes tells you about all the famous figures from the 19th century.
Yeah.
I took that for granted. I thought it was amazing, but I didn't realize how much I would go back to that night and think about that.
Yes.
I wish I could hear him do that again.
Oh, God, just the luminaries.
Yeah.
And lots of schools have that, but there's, I don't know, there are people who will say, oh, well, you can get a good education anywhere. Just you can. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's certain schools, certain communities where there's just been this concentration of brilliance, a concentration of questioning, and a depth of exploration. And when you step into that stream, it is different.
Yeah.
I actually do. I believe it's different.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful to have been invited into that stream and then to have stayed in it, for 20 years in Boston.
Yeah.
I loved the fact that just felt like everybody was walking around sitting with big questions.
Yeah.
They weren't, they weren't. But it felt like that in the air, there was a buzz. I live in New York City now. It's a different buzz in the air in New York. In New York, it's doing. In Boston, it was a buzz of thinking.
Yeah.
And that really worked for me for 20 years.
Yeah, there's an old lady, and I served a church in Berkeley, and
Yes.
she said, what I love about Berkeley is everybody's rushing off to learn something.
Yes.
I'll never forget Elise Ott many years said that.
There's an eagerness,
Yeah,
exactly.
And I just remember those teachers we had, even in fields that weren't in my own field.
Yeah.
And I'm still they're still with me, those teachers.
Yeah.
Anna Marie Schimmel taught that Rumi class.
Ooh.
It was it's like an outlier, but I still think about her all the time.
Yeah.
Were there classes that you particularly loved or teachers that you particularly influenced?
Oh, yeah.
In seminary and at HDS.
Yeah. Well, and that's like I did seminary where I did divinity school at HDS at Harvard.
Yeah, 2 years.
I was not Christian.
Yeah.
At the time. So I did 3 years. I did a slower program because I was fresh out of college. So I did the Master of Theological Studies, but I did it in 3 years and took courses just across. Like I audited a lot of classes. And I think one of my favorite classes was with Harvey Cox and Meg Guyder.
Oh, yeah.
Meg Guyder was a nun, is a Catholic nun, who was teaching at Weston Jesuit School of Theology, which was just around the way from HDS. And so they taught this course together on liberation theology. And she had actually been a nun in El Salvador. And so when she was teaching and talking about liberation theology, you're like, oh, this is not conceptual.
Yeah.
Like she was friends with people who were killed. And her commitment to spirituality, a spirituality that saves lives, it was just like, wow, like I knew Christianity as urgent because of the evangelicals around me when I was growing up who were like, you need to be Christian because this is the only way out of hell.
Yeah.
And so there was an urgency for them. I think with Meg and Harvey Cox and other liberation theology folks, I discovered the urgency of Jesus, the urgency of faith, but it was around life now.
Yeah.
It wasn't around getting out of hell. It was around like, how will we live right here? And the idea that like, it can be better.
Yeah.
It can be whole. We can be whole. And we can do that for each other, in the power of the Spirit. So that's what I'll be preaching on later.
Oh, I'm so excited. But you can't help it when you're like preaching a sermon and you're talking this long, it has to come out somehow.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It totally does. Yeah, it's like I've been sitting with those questions for a few days now. But no, those were, again, those classes, they were formation.
Yeah, they were.
They weren't just, it wasn't just book stuff. We were being formed.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm so grateful for that.
Too. I was there for 7 years, and it was great.
Yes.
Best 7 years. It was
high fives.
I know. thanks to our teachers. Here's to Harvey Cox. And all the
of
other,
them.
Yeah, all of them. They were great. So you worked as a newspaper, like a reporter, like a religion reporter. Mm-hmm. We had Gus Niebuhr on the program one time.
Oh, how cool.
He was great. Great. But what kind of skills do you need to have in order to be effective as a religion news writer? And there's so fewer of them now.
There are.
So what are we missing because we don't have people who are focused on that area of human life?
Yeah, it's really it's too bad. I feel like I kind of came up in a heyday.
Yeah, you're like almost the end of it.
No, actually, I was the beginning in some ways of it because when I came out of Harvard Divinity in '96, I was kind of being recruited by different newspapers who were saying at the time, they're like, you could actually have a religion beat. Like religion beats were very new then. And so they liked the idea of having somebody who had gone to divinity school and studied American religious history and movements for social change. That was my focus at Harvard. And so when I left, I was actually really well prepared for just going around and be like, so what are the stories about religion? And especially, how are people experiencing God? And the many, many, many ways that happens, I was fascinated by it as a student. And so as a religion reporter, I got to kind of put on my cap and go around just discovering, wow. So, and I was in Tennessee at the time, and I got to discover, it's like, wow, this is how, like a former Baptist church, that closed, then got reopened as a Hindu temple,
Right.
And, what's the transition process for that like? And what's been the story of Hindus coming into Knoxville, Tennessee, through a lot of the science-based fields and things like that, but now really finding a home there and making a faith home there.
Right.
And, I would host roundtables, on, like I remember it was when Dolly, the sheep had just been cloned.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And so I hosted a roundtable with different leaders. I had a couple of faculty from the university. I had, like a Baptist minister who's like, this is a sin, because that's what he says about everything. But anyway, and then I had, like a rabbi, and other folks. And so the story that I wrote was actually like about their conversation about cloning and the ethics of cloning and what does this mean for human life. And so I had a blast as a religion reporter.
Well, I just think of Diana Eck doing that pluralism project.
Yes.
And just you're right. I mean, it was she's kind of discovering that from a more intellectual, abstract way, and you're writing about practically what it means in Tennessee.
It was awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
It was so awesome. And but I couldn't live in Tennessee anymore.
Yeah.
I went back to work at the newspaper, but especially to save my mother from the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Oh yeah.
And so
gotta go back to
that's a whole other.
We're here.
She was living alone, and and they had been knocking on the door, and she was like, I was talking to her on the phone, and I could tell she's getting deeper and deeper with this group of folks, and I'm cool with the witnesses, but not if they're gonna take my mother.
Yeah.
I was like, you can't have mama. No. And so when she was telling me on the phone about, there'll be places where I can see you, and we won't be together for holidays or whatever, but we'll still be connected. I'm like, no, you're not explaining to me how they're extracting you from your life. No. So that was honestly when I graduated from Harvard. It was like, I'm moving back to Tennessee to save my mom.
Yeah, help her.
And so I moved her into a different apartment. And got her going to a Baptist church. Yeah. And so once that project was done, it's like, all right, she's fully ensconced with Christians that I can work with.
Right, completely.
And then I got a job offer to come back to Boston. It was like, okay, that's where I feel alive.
Yeah.
And so I went back.
Oh, I just felt I love being there so much. So how did you get from being a news reporter to being a priest?
I experienced conversion.
Yeah.
Honestly, and maybe there's another book in there somewhere about.
I think there is.
Yeah, no, because for me it was that I was writing stories about other people's religious lives.
Yeah.
And it just kind of hit me. I want a religious life. Finally.
Yeah.
That I was writing these stories, I was holding these spaces for people to talk about what God was up to in their lives. And I realized that I didn't want to just be on the edge of that I didn't just want to report on how God was moving, but I wanted to help people to have a life with God.
Yeah.
And and so I started meandering back in, and within a year of moving back to Boston, I was baptized.
Oh yeah. So where were you baptized?
I was baptized at a Resurrection Lutheran Church.
In where is it?
In Roxbury. So it's in the black neighborhood in Boston.
Yeah.
Yeah. I started going there because there was this hot guy.
Yeah.
And he was doing it. Like, I want it to be more noble, but it's not.
Right.
It's just not. He was hot,
Yeah, exactly.
and he was like, hey, we knew each other from Harvard Divinity, and he was doing his Lutheran intern year there or something like that. I can't remember, but he's like, can you help me out with teaching Sunday school? And I'm like, yeah, can we do lessons Saturday nights?
Yeah, right, completely. What are you doing this week?
That was really how it developed. And then he went off to get ordained as a Lutheran pastor, and I was still there at the church working with the kids, working with, it was a liberation community.
Yeah.
It was a community where, the organist was a gay man with AIDS, living with AIDS, Swedish Lutheran. And he taught himself how to play black gospel music on the keyboard.
Wow.
Because this was in a historic black community. Yeah. So it was a Swedish Lutheran church that learned how to embrace its neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's great. And so there were, the kids in the program, I was doing youth group. Most of them were foster kids or living in foster homes. It was just folk from every margin possible, and they were growing as leaders.
Yeah.
They were growing in Christ. They were so powerful. And that's where I got to learn community organizing. And but faith-based community organizing, the idea that like God is moving in the lives of people that we don't even usually notice or that we think need help. They don't need help. They figured so much of this stuff out. Yeah. Walk with them.
Right.
And so it was one of the first churches where I saw all of my liberation theology theory and praxis and all that. Like all the stuff I had studied and dreamt of, I found a church, this little church in Roxbury where they were living it.
Oh, I love
and that was where I got baptized.
Oh, that's so great.
At 28 years old.
Yeah, I love to think of you just as like Sunday school superintendent and working with the kids.
Yeah, driving vans.
Driving vans completely.
Crazy. And by the way, I'm not that big with kids. Like they don't like me that much. You know, I don't get kids that much, but it was but that's how I knew it was the Spirit. You know?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Completely. It gets you out of the like little rut that you're normally in and puts you somewhere totally different.
Yeah.
So how did you decide to go to seminary after that? Like,
well, the Lutherans I was hanging with, and like I said, you know, I was doing some lay ministry with them. I already had a degree from a divinity school, but was lay minister with them, was working at Harvard Divinity and admissions, and then created the first career services program at the school. Because again, I was like, all right, I'm helping all these people to get admitted, and they're coming in with big dreams. Is anybody going to help them to actually make that real on the other end?
Exactly. Because you're right. I mean, when you said you went to being a journalist afterwards, I was like, they were telling us, be journalists, be journalists.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine, they didn't tell us.
Or go do policy, or go do whatever.
It's like, there's no way to get a job in those things.
No. So I actually when I came back, I started career services, and it's still going. And I'm so glad that they're doing that. And other schools have that now too.
Yeah.
But anyway, I, again, in the career services mode, it's like, wow, I'm helping people to discern what God is doing in their lives. And I hear God saying that God wants to do something in mine that's different. And the Lutherans, I was kind of testing a calling with them. But I was like, this isn't the place. Yeah. And in my community organizing, the faith-based community organizing I was doing in Boston, I got to know a lot of Episcopalians. And that was where I learned about Episcopalians and resurrection.
Yeah.
Episcopalians and welcome. Episcopalians and just our history, you know, our history around race, which is pretty pitiful, but then also the ways that we had stepped up on gender and sexuality.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, you know, I feel like that church has got a lot of potential.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of really amazing white Episcopal leaders in their 60s who became friends of mine.
Yeah.
And I was like this black kid in her late 20s.
Yeah.
And I would take walks with them, and we would just be hanging out in the city. I look back now, and I'm like, what was that? Like, people must have thought I was their caretaker or something.
Yeah, right, completely.
Like, how often do you
see... the steps.
Yeah, like, how often do you see a black young person, like in their 20s, walking around with their friend, this old, rich white lady?
Yeah.
And yet that was what was happening, and they were the ones, not many others, but especially Fran Early and William Barnwell.
Oh, yeah, right.
William Barnwell at Trinity Church, Boston.
Completely.
William sat me down one time, and he's like, Stephanie, I'd like to have lunch with you. He's from New Orleans. So I'd like to have lunch. So we had lunch. Yeah. And he said, are those Lutherans ever going to ordain you? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not sure if they see a call in me. Yeah. And he's like, well, maybe you need to be exploring that with us.
Yeah, wow.
And so he set up a meeting for me with the canon, you know, to the ordinary. And I started the process for ordination in the Episcopal Church before I was received into the Anglican community.
As you were talking, I just shut my eyes. I can see the diocesan offices, and I can imagine you going in there.
Oh, yeah, no, I went into the discernment day, and the bishop walked up to me, and he's like, he was this monk. The bishop there, Tom Shaw, he was a monk. Yeah. The guy had just like the sight, you know, like he saw things. Yeah. He walks up and he's like,
your name.
Are you actually Episcopalian? He says, at the discernment day. Like, who thinks to do that? And as it happened, I wasn't.
Yeah, right.
I'm like, who told you? How did you sense this about me? But no, they, you know, and I had also had this like conversion, or like a vision for what ministry could be. I'd been dancing like at a nightclub in New York, the Limelight.
Yeah.
And because I was thinking, it was like, am I going to be a community organizer or a Lutheran pastor or what? and I was dancing at the Limelight, and I had a vision. And it's important to note that the Limelight was a deconsecrated Episcopal church. So it was a nightclub that used to be an Episcopal church. And I don't know, I think it was deconsecrated maybe in the early 80s, and then it was reopened as a club in the 90s, probably, something like that. So I was there like right about 2000. And I had a vision, Malcolm, in the vision, dancing, surrounded by mostly gay men, that night at the club. And the vision was of 3 banners unfurling.
Wow.
And the banner said, celebration, liberation, transformation.
Wow.
And I heard God say, build me a church.
Wow.
Build me a church where this community and others like them know how much I love them.
Yeah.
And so I left that club that morning and, and journaled my way into, I think I'm supposed to be an Episcopal priest.
Yeah.
And so all of those folks like William Barnwell saying it, had already, but it was that night/morning that I really felt the call. And so I went home to Boston and started knocking on the doors of Episcopal churches, saying, this is going to sound wacky, but I think I'm supposed to be with you all.
Yeah.
And I think I'm supposed to plant a church. And then I did.
Yeah, right. Because
we started a church called The Crossing.
Yeah, I was at St. John's Bowdoin Street, and so that's where I did all my field ed.
Yeah.
So Richard Valentassis and Jennifer Phillips were the rectors there.
Yeah.
It was the heyday of it. I mean, we had this wonderful gay community. We were doing hundreds of AIDS funerals. It was like we were in the trenches.
Oh my God.
But like all my first sermons were to people who didn't have housing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was for that we'd have a soup kitchen dinner, and then I'd preach to a bunch of people who were at the soup kitchen dinner.
Totally.
And I imagine those are the beginning of your congregation, right?
It was. It absolutely was.
Yeah. So tell us about The Crossing and how it came into being, and what it's meant for you.
It's still going, which is crazy.
I love that. I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, we launched this church in 2006, and it was a church that was designed to take the gifts of Anglicanism, the charisms, the heart of Anglicanism, and to express it through the lens or from the perspective of folk of color, queer folks, people who didn't have as much education, a lot of homeless people.
Yeah.
And just people on the margins. So it's kind of taking Anglican traditions to the margins.
Yeah.
But we were launching this church that was living into this at a cathedral.
Yeah, right.
It's one of the reasons I love Grace too. I mean, it's like, I worked at a cathedral for 7 years in Boston where we were doing margin ministry, but we were doing it at the center. And we launched in 2006. And with, just radical welcome at the center of it.
Yeah.
And my job as the priest was not to be the one who told everybody everything, but instead I coached the preachers. The preachers were lay people.
Yeah.
I didn't preach at The Crossing once for the first 3 years.
Yeah.
And we met every Thursday night for Eucharist. I celebrated Eucharist, and I did it extemporaneously.
Yeah.
So I did extemporaneous Eucharistic prayer. The community told me, they're like, we need you to put that book down. Everything else we're doing is speaking
feels good.
to us.
It feels alive.
And then you open up a book.
Yeah.
It just throws everything off. And they're like, what am I supposed to do? They're like, just pray it. Just pray it. It's like, they didn't teach me to do that in seminary.
Right, they didn't.
But I
did.
did. You just pray it. You know the story of Jesus and salvation and that night before he died. It's like, you just pray it. But my job was training leaders. I was a community organizer. Yeah. And in fact, my title was priest and lead organizer.
Lead organizer.
So like when you're looking at like different, like faith-based community organizations, these different, groups that are doing activist work on the streets, they often have a lead organizer.
Yeah.
So I was lead organizer for the church.
Yeah, that's great.
And I was just meeting a couple of months ago with the woman who is the newest priest and lead organizer at The Crossing, almost 20 years later.
Yeah, it makes me so happy because I'm like literally, so St. John's Bowdoin Street, that ministry is a Thursday night ministry.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It just like was not in a church anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everything crumbled at St. John's. But it makes me, for the first time, I feel like, oh my gosh, St. John's is still alive, but it's alive as the crossing.
Yeah.
But this is the first time I've ever realized that.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's in the air.
I'm so glad that's still alive and still flourishing. So
Absolutely.
Those gatherings, I discovered it. I just joined it. I didn't make it.
Yeah.
But that's great. So you were there at the crossing for all those years.
7 years.
Yeah,
7 years at the cathedral, 7 years with the crossing as a church planter.
Yeah.
Really, but after year 3, the funds were, kind of done with the cathedral. So I was a fundraiser. I was working as an editor for church publishing. That's how I paid my rent.
Yeah.
And then writing books, and helping other folks to write books, and then you get back to the the weird kid,
right.
who was always typing, and and now I'm an editor for a publishing house and writing stuff and priesting, and it was like, okay, God, this is what you meant. This is what you meant to have happen all along.
Yeah, it was like all these things from different parts of your life all together.
And then it comes together.
Yeah.
It's amazing what God will do.
It is amazing what God will do. And God kind of makes you a certain way. Yeah. It's just amazing to find that it's useful to the world.
Right? It's a relief, honestly.
It is a relief, totally.
Boy, I'm glad that whatever it is that you were doing in this weird kid, God, I'm glad that it's helpful to your project, your dream. In any way.
I often find it's like when Jesus feeds the 5,000 and nothing was wasted.
Yes.
Like in our lives, there's nothing that's wasted.
Not a bit.
Like we think it's wasted because we haven't used it yet, but in the future, we're going to use it somehow.
Yeah.
Whatever experience it was that we had. So did you go from there to being canon in Long Island?
Yes.
Like what was that?
Yeah, that was wild. That was completely wild. I had done 7 years with the crossing, and I had heard, the best practice around church planting is that you should, after 7 years, it's time to turn over to new leadership. Otherwise, the church will never be able to do it. And so I left after 7 years, and I knew I was at that mark. So I went to the bishop's office in Boston and, said, Bishop Shaw, I'm going to be leaving in about 8 months. I gave them lots and lots of runway for it because, again, church plant starting, it's just a different kind of transition.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't just say 2 months, I'm out.
Right, yeah.
So I went to the bishop's office, was like, I'm going to be leaving in 8 months. He's like, okay, where are you going? I was like, I'm moving to New York. He's like, what will you be doing? I said, I don't know. He's like, why are you going? I said, it's time to live juicy.
Yeah, yeah.
Try telling your bishop monk that.
I love that.
And he was, bless him, he was like, his response was, I can honestly say I've never made a life decision based on that criteria.
I love that. Oh my gosh.
But he encouraged me, and the Bishop of Long Island, who was a former Roman Catholic priest, and then became a rector of Episcopal churches, and then became a bishop. And of course, the Diocese of Long Island is actually all of Brooklyn, all of Queens, and then the rest of Long Island, Suffolk, and Nassau counties, the Hamptons, all of that. So that diocese covers from Brooklyn and Queens in their entirety to the Hamptons. So it is an extraordinary diocese, just extraordinary in every way. So much racial, cultural, linguistic, political diversity. It's there.
Yeah.
It's all there. And so I went there as the canon for missional vitality.
Oh, I like that.
And that was a hoot.
Yeah.
That was a hoot, being kind of inside after all of those years, being kind of the margin preacher kind of person, to be a canon. And then, of course, going from there to being a canon to Bishop Curry.
Yeah, like how did that happen?
Yeah.
I totally we all want to know what that's like. I'm like, how did you become the canon to the ordinary for the presiding bishop?
Yeah.
And then the canon to the presiding bishop.
Yeah.
And then, what is that like? Like, what do you do?
Does it look like fun? Do you imagine it would be fun working with Michael Curry, Presiding Bishop Michael Curry? Yeah. It is. I feel like working with Bishop Curry has been the best thing for my faith.
Yeah.
I love Jesus. I love love. All of these things were real for me, but it's become so much more real, so much more internalized. It's like having Bishop Curry as your boss is like having a spiritual director, an executive coach, like the wisest and like savviest political
mind,
Yeah.
a genius who remembers everything. All of that is Michael Curry.
Yeah.
Like, people have no idea the brilliance of that man. His preaching throws it off. I think they don't realize that his greatest skill is not his preaching, it's his listening.
Yeah.
He listens. He listens people into speech. He listens people into whatever it is that we're supposed to be. 9 years with him has just been glory.
Yeah.
It's been, just like, it's kind of that wow and gratitude thing I was talking about with Harvard.
Right.
It's like 9 years of working with Bishop Curry. I'm like, I could not have asked for a better school of life, school of church, school for following Jesus. And to be able to in any way share that and open that up for the rest of the church has just been amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I when you mentioned earlier, like, oh, that little girl who wanted to like travel, like you must have been all sorts. Like, where have you gone as a result of this?
Well, like when I leave here tomorrow morning, I'm going to Milwaukee.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to go there.
Yes. I love football.
Yeah.
So I've definitely gone to Milwaukee a few times and like made pilgrimage to Lambeau Field.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I couldn't have asked for it.
Yeah.
I couldn't have asked for it.
Yeah, I love it. What it gives me hope for is that like you can have a 9-year stage and be so transformed.
Yes.
Like that God's formation of us isn't done.
Yeah.
Like, and you might be right at the opening of a door into a new life where you're going to have that. Yeah, I mean, you must have learned so much from him.
So
and he must have learned
much.
so much from you too. I mean, it's I just think for that intergenerational thing is really important too.
Yeah, no, that's true. And that's one of the reasons that he asked me to be one of his canons, like soon after he was
how
elected.
did he know to ask you?
Well, I had been chaplain to the House of Bishops.
Right. So what was that? How did you get to do that?
Yeah.
Because Tom Shaw was the bishop to the chaplain to the House.
Well,
of Bishops.
a lot of the monks from his order had been chaplains to the House of Bishops. And so when Catherine Jefferts Shorey, our presiding bishop at the time when I was chaplain, she was the one who asked me to be a chaplain. And it was partly because Bishop Tom Shaw had said, well, there's a priest in my diocese who's actually really, I think she'd be a great chaplain.
Yeah.
She's a church planter. She's 30, I think I was maybe 36 at the time. And he's like, but I think she would really be good for this. Yeah. And so I get a call from Presiding Bishop Jefferts Shorey's office saying, hi, we'd like to talk to you about being a chaplain to the House of Bishops. I'm like, this is a joke.
Yeah, right. Is that you, John?
Exactly. He's like, Frank, you better cut that stuff out. What you done?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like, oh my God, this is real. And again, that was a blessing because what ended up happening was that the whole House of Bishops, all of those bishops of our church became my congregation.
Yeah.
And I loved them. I loved the crazy calling that they say yes to. I learned how to preach a really challenging word. Because we preached, like chaplains, especially when I was doing it for 6 years, I think, 7 actually. We would preach at every gathering of the House of Bishops.
Wow.
We organized all of their worship. We did confession, or rite of reconciliation.
Yeah, right.
We did pastoral counseling. So truly, I was a priest to the bishops, and so that's on the one hand, I'm a priest, and I was a young priest, but doing this with bishops. But I was their priest, so it's like, look, you're going to have to eventually, if you want spiritual counsel in this zone, this is where it is.
Yeah.
So a lot of them, learned to lean on me for that, and I learned to trust God in me with them, and to preach a word that was challenging but encouraging, and so much learning.
Yeah.
Oh my God, so much learning.
Yeah, when I first got here, I asked David Forbes, he was in his 90s or late 80s, to be the chaplain to the cathedral staff.
Yes.
And he was great for all those things. Somebody to hear confessions, somebody to be with us for social gatherings. It was really, really helpful to have him.
Yep.
But I know he had an insight into what was going on here that you could never get any other way.
Right.
Tell me a little bit, like, what did you learn about bishops? What did you learn about the House of Bishops just through this yourself?
Yeah, well, and I think, and again, continuing working with Bishop Curry and serving on his senior team.
Doing that,
and I need to give a shout out to others who were working on the presiding bishop staff, like Miguel Bustos, Reverend Miguel,
exactly.
who is the manager for racial justice and reconciliation for the whole Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
So we're on that team together. And I think what you learn is that there's such just extraordinary diversity in our church. And we're all still living out some of those core Anglican callings around making the gospel real in your context. A church that is Catholic, but also reforming, always reforming.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think, a church that's trying to figure out what it means to be so historically rooted, but also moving forward.
Yeah.
So to see how that gets lived out everywhere, like to be in Iowa and to see it lived out, and then to be in San Francisco, and then to be in Taiwan, and then to be in Paris. Like all of these places are where the Episcopal Church is.
Yeah.
And to do revivals in all of those places. And just to see Episcopalians figuring out how are we going to live this thing, in our day and age. And honestly, especially when church as a whole is struggling. The whole church project, the organized religion project is really struggling.
Yeah.
I see people everywhere trying to figure out how to reinvent, how to make it real. And I love being a part of encouraging and sending them, and also putting hard stuff in front of them, like in Church Cracked Open, putting hard history and hard things in front of us too, but saying we can do this, we can bear it. Don't try to bury your head in the sand on this one. Like it's too important. The stakes are too high. Lift up, and we'll do this thing together with God.
Yeah, definitely. What advice do you have for people who are just beginning to learn how to preach, like to new preachers? Because I love to think of you working with the Crossing people, but even today, what advice do you have for preachers?
I love working with preachers. I love working with lay preachers in particular. I love helping people to figure out, again, what is God trying to say through you? What is the word that only you can speak? Now I sound like, what's that Natasha Bedingfield song, unwritten, no one else can read it for you, only you can. Anyway, but no, what I say to folks, because there's a training actually that I do with lay preachers, where I say, there are 4 points. What is the story of God? And that's where you're looking at Scripture. What is the story of God? Whatever is happening in that Scripture passage. What is the story of, what is my story? So how does my life intersect with that Scripture? It matters. It matters how your story connects with that Scripture. But then, what is the story of us? So what is this community? What is its life saying in relation to the Scripture? And the story of now. And so there are also the prompts for community organizing, public narrative.
Right, exactly.
And so why does this matter now? Why does this matter to us? So that's my, like a sermon needs to have a story of God, the story of me, the story of us, and the story of now.
Yeah. I love that.
There you go.
That's great. So one of our traditions is we take questions from our audience.
Yeah.
And so there may be people with questions. I'm just letting people know, right? Down your questions. I enjoyed reading your book very much. It was such a blessing to be able to just kind of think about Episcopal Church history again. Mm-hmm. And so I think
the good, the bad, the ugly.
I know it's really true. I mean, I think there's, like you say, there's ways in which just having women who are ordained means that, compared to the Southern Baptists or the Roman Catholic Church. Having LGBTQ people involved at every level of ministry. I mean, I can't take those things for granted. And yet, you're right, we have this history of kind of a way of being, kind of an ethos that was shaped as being kind of the chaplain to the empire, the way that you put it. But how did you get the idea to write the book? And then, what is the general idea behind it, just for the people who haven't read it?
So Church Cracked Open, I wrote at the height of pandemic.
It feels like that, by the the way. I can almost hear the sirens outside your apartment.
I can certainly hear them. Because I reached out to my editor, my friend at the publishing house, and said in June, I think, of 2020, I need to write a book. Because We've been shut out of our churches, and so that's falling apart. We, George Floyd had just been murdered before our very eyes.
Yeah.
And so something about America and racism was finally being revealed, but also our national character was being revealed as bankrupt. And so that was falling apart. And just economic free fall, in that moment. And so it's just like everything is falling apart. Everything is cracking open.
Yeah.
What's possible? What is possible when our fingers can no longer grasp and cling to a particular form of church?
Yeah.
When America can no longer cling to the idea that we are this perfect, experiment. Sitting on the hill.
Yeah.
Like, actually, no, we're not. We're not. We never have been.
Yeah.
And the sooner we admit that, the sooner we can actually become what God needs us to be. And so I was like, I want to write a book where I just help us to do some reckoning. Look at our history in our church around empire, our history of supporting structures of power and being chaplains to empire. That's our story, especially around slavery, but so much more, so much more. And so I delved deep into that story in order to say, y'all, this is who we've been. If we don't want to be that anymore, if we actually want to be followers of Jesus, then we've got to make some hard choices.
Yeah.
And we can.
Yeah.
And so I try to tell the hard stories about the Episcopal Church and race and white supremacy and class, but then also to tell the stories of some of those luminaries. I call them shards of light.
I know, like Paul Washington. That was a beautiful section of the book.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. To think of Sue Hyatt, just like being a young person, and him being so brave to have the Philadelphia 11 ordained
a
in
black
his church.
priest in Philadelphia who made his church the home for, for Black Power movement, but also for women's liberation.
Exactly.
When he was already on the line himself.
Yeah.
And so
I know that the quote you have from him about just like defying his bishop, the presiding bishop, the whole general convention, and how frightening that was. Because you see the result, you don't see the inner part of it. But and Barbara Harris was there too as the senior warden. I mean, you didn't even mention that in here, but I mean, all our friends were there in that one place.
Yes. Yeah. And so I wanted to find those stories of the risk takers, the not just mavericks, but Episcopalians who had leveraged their privilege in order to move into solidarity and be a part of movements for liberation.
Yeah.
And I'm a broken record on that stuff. I'm always trying to figure out how do we take this gift that God's given us as a church and use it for the sake of love.
Yeah.
And so in here is like, right, how do we take the good, the bad, the ugly parts of being Episcopal and what that's meant and what the Church of England was even before that, and then leverage that for good?
Yeah.
How can God use all of that history, all of that oppressive story? How can God free it and free us so that we can follow Jesus with our whole hearts, follow his way of love, be a part of movements for freedom and solidarity? And so it felt amazing to write a book about that journey.
Yeah.
I needed to believe we could do that. I needed to believe that coming out of this pandemic, and again, this was 2020. I wrote the book in 7 weeks, in the summer of 2020. And there was a lot of hope that I had in that time, but also deep despair. Yeah. But I had to hope that God can do something with these fragments on the ground. God can rebuild a church that God intended all along. God can rebuild a church from these fragments, and we get to be a part of that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I love most about it is I think there's a tendency among so many people around us to have this nostalgia for when church life was booming.
Right.
And what it came away from is just feeling like I'm so much better suited for this church that accepts everybody and is trying to accept everybody.
Yes.
And it's so much better to be part of a church that's broken than to be part of a church that thinks it's not broken, but is still, carrying on this tradition of racism and sexism, et cetera.
Well, and it's the brokenness I think that God can use.
Yeah.
What's the wonderful Leonard Cohen?
Yeah, right.
Exactly. Ring the bells that still can ring.
Yeah.
Forget your perfect offering. there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why are we trying to pretend that we're perfect, that we've got everything together, our churches or in our personal lives? God uses the cracks. God shines through those.
Yeah.
So embrace it. Embrace what was broken. Embrace the failures. And then partner up with God, who will walk you through, like in your weakness, that's where God can be strong.
Yeah.
Like I believe that. I believe that with all of my heart.
Yeah, me too.
And so I was like, wow, the very moment when we felt like we were at our worst was actually the moment that God could use us best.
Yeah.
Just sit with that.
Yeah, it's so true.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we have some questions. Having served across the church in so many ways as priest, diocesan canon, as presiding Bishop Curry's canon, what is your take on Bishop Sean Rowe's vision for the next 9 years?
Yes.
Great question.
Hey.
And it was written so I could read it.
Yay. I love me some Sean Rowe. I knew him before. Each of us in our own ways, we've been kind of these like gadflies, I think, in the church saying, like, we're clinging to the wrong stuff, y'all. We need to let go. We need to let go. We need to travel lightly, like going back to like Luke 10, the idea of, like, stop carrying all that stuff with you. Like put down the bag, put down the like, you don't need the shoes. You don't need all of this. What you need is Jesus.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Bishop Sean is the perfect presiding bishop for this moment. And the more I've seen him leaning into this transition, the more I believe this, is that we need to figure out how to be church in a whole different way. I feel like Bishop Curry helped us to get really focused and clear on following Jesus.
Yeah.
And even like following Jesus in the neighborhood, like with our neighbors, going public with our faith. But that travel lightly piece is where I think Sean Rowe is the leader for that journey.
Yeah.
To help us to reconfigure, and not just to cut budgets. It's not that at all. And it's not just to cut staff, thank God. But it's to say, like, how do we simplify so that we can be the church for God's mission in this moment? Because I think that's a question for everybody.
Yeah.
It totally is. Yeah. That we've built structures and institutions, we built diocesan structures for a church that doesn't exist and doesn't make sense in a lot of the places we're in. Yeah. And so we see a lot of dioceses, or a lot of states, for instance, where, like Wisconsin, this actually just happened, where I think there were 2 dioceses in Wisconsin. 3, there were 3. And now there's 1. They've come together.
That's smart.
It's amazing. The dioceses of I think Eastern and Western Michigan are now like a diocese of the Great Lakes. Like everywhere you look, we're figuring out, like, what do we actually need in order to be church? And it's different than what we needed to be institution.
Yeah.
And I feel like Bishop Rowe gets that. He just gets that in his bones. He's lived it. He's got a PhD in organizational development, for God's sake. Literally, for God's sake.
Literally, for God's sake.
Yeah, and so no, I'm very excited about what he's going to do. He's a man of God, but he's also a man, like, he understands, like, that there's some adaptive work for us to do. Yeah. And we're not going to be able to think our way out of this one, but we're going to have to pray our way and experiment our way out of it in the power of the Spirit.
Yeah, that's great. What a good word. Thank you. When you think of Grace Cathedral, what comes to mind, and what can you imagine for our role as a cathedral in San Francisco and the United States?
Yay.
I love that question.
I love Grace. I love Grace. I love the solidarity that Grace has expressed, with your neighbors in so many ways, particularly LGBTQIA plus neighbors. I think the thing, and we've had this conversation, and I've preached here before and said it, that my dream, what I think would be extraordinary for Grace, is if Grace more and more expressed the fullness of, and the diversity and the color and the life of San Francisco. Yeah. I love this city so much. I got my calling in a city like this, in settings like this. I remember when I discovered Glad Memorial, as I think even before I was baptized, again, I heard about Glide. I visited Glide. I visited Grace. And to this day, I kind of feel like, how did the Methodists get that?
Right.
Like, we're the ones for that makes sense
it's
for,
true.
you know? I mean, to be this, like, church that's love for everybody.
Yeah.
So I would love to see Grace being even more fearless and more kind of global in its expression of the ways that we say yes to God. Yeah. And the ways that we sing God's praises and the ways that we pray our hearts out to God. I feel like Grace could hold that. And I want to see you all do that.
Yeah.
So, and we've talked about it.
Totally.
So,
the Spirit is alive here. I mean, it's just like, it's tangible. And you walk in the building and you can feel it.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it. And it's tangible, you know, to folks. I was sitting in a bar last night working on my sermon.
Yeah.
I was sitting at Matador, which is like a couple of streets below here. They got a great happy hour, you know, every day of the week until 5, $3 tacos. You know, $5 margaritas. Yeah. Just saying. Yeah, so it's really, I can stretch an expensive account. Let me tell you. But I'm sitting there working at the bar, you know, at my laptop. This woman's next to me, and you know, we get to chatting because I like to do that. It's part of why I like to sit in public places when I'm writing sermons. Is to be like, what's the conversation that just people are having in this place? So I'm having that conversation with this woman. Her name is Erin. And she just moved from another part of San Francisco to the Tenderloin.
Yeah.
And the way we started talking was that there was a fruit fly that kept trying to fly into my red wine.
It's the season for that now.
Yeah. And so I eventually put a napkin over it, and then I was laughing as I was doing it.
Church.
And I turned to her and was like, "Did you ever go to Catholic church or church and stuff as a kid?" She's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "You remember how they would have that fancy, you know, well ironed, embroidered napkin thing over the wine?"
Yeah.
You know, she's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "That's what I just did." and I'm doing it for the same reason. Like, it looks all ritual and stuff. And like, it's actually to keep the fruit flies out of the communion wine. And I just did that here. And then she's like, "Wow, are you about church?" I'm like, "Actually, yeah, I'm a priest and I'm preaching at Grace tomorrow." And
come hear me.
Yeah, and so, but she was like, "Oh, Grace. Oh, wow. I love that church." She's like, "I'm so happy to be living closer to it." She's like, "I've never gone inside." Yeah. I'm like, "Why not? Come in tomorrow." But she's like, "But I just know, I just feel this great energy around that church. Like, I'm giving you, like, this is what your neighbors who've never been inside say." She's like, and I love, she's an event planner.
Oh, great.
She's like, "I love how they're doing so much more coming out of pandemic." She hadn't really thought about this. Coming out of pandemic, they really opened their doors. And the things that they're doing are just fascinating. So, like, that's what your neighbors are saying about you right now. So, well done.
Well, you know, I've never done this before. I've never run over so far.
Ah!
Man, what a great conversation. It just shows we'll have to have, like, the next book comes out, we'll have to have to be continued.
I'm going to be working on one starting in January.
Oh, I'm glad.
And I'll be coming here to do research.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, come visit us.
Thank you.
Please join us on October 27th when our guest will be Bishop Bill Swing. He'll be talking about his new book, God and Nuclear Weapons, Meditations at the End of the Atomic Age. Mm-hmm. Bishop Swing is also preaching at the 11 o'clock a.m. Choral Eucharist. You're always welcome to join us upstairs for Choral Eucharist at 11 a.m. I encourage you to buy a copy of The Church Cracked Open. It's available in the back. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, THINK, to 76278. So that's THINK to 76278. Stephanie, what a blessing. I feel like you've all just given us like this new energy. And I know that hearing you preach upstairs is going to feel like that too. And, you know, Thursday you were that was a beautiful sermon.
Bless you.
Like one of my favorite memories of Grace Cathedral was made this week at the installation. Yeah.
Praise God for all of it.
Yeah, so let me take you the
you.
back way. Thanks be to God for all of us being together. Amen.
And for all of you. Yay.